there is a star system just under 40 light years from Earth, close enough that in theory, a signal sent today could arrive within a human lifetime. It sits quietly in the southern sky. Two stars, locked in orbit around one another. Unremarkable. Almost forgotten among thousands of others. It's called Zeta Reticuli. On its own, it means nothing, just another entry in a catalogue of nearby stars, measured, observed, understood. A binary system, drifting in silence. And for most of human history, it would have remained exactly that. But what makes this system different is not what it is. It's where it appears. Because over the past several decades, the name Zeta Reticuli has surfaced in a series of accounts that should have no connection to one another. Different people, different times, different circumstances, no shared background, no clear link, and yet the same location keeps returning. Not once, not twice, but enough times to raise a question. Is it coincidence? Or is something being repeated? In 1989, a man named Bob Lazar stepped forward with a claim that would quickly become one of the most controversial stories in modern history. He said he had worked at a secret facility near Area 51, a place known as S4, hidden, remote, and far from public view. His role, he claimed, was to study technology that did not originate from Earth, machines unlike anything publicly known, craft that seemed to defy the rules of physics. And when asked where this technology came from, his answer was precise: Zeta Reticuli. But Lazar was not the first to mention it. Nearly 3 decades earlier, in 1961, a couple traveling through rural New Hampshire reported an experience that would later become one of the most well-known cases of its kind. Betty and Barney Hill. What they described was not immediate. It came later, through hypnosis. Fragmented memories began to surface. Details that, at the time, made little sense. Among them, a map, a pattern of stars, shown during the encounter. Something unfamiliar, something they could not identify. Years later, that drawing was examined, compared against known star systems, and one possible match stood out. Zeta Reticuli. 2 separate accounts, separated by decades. No connection, no shared origin. And yet, the same system appears. On their own, each of these stories can be explained. Memory is imperfect. Details can shift. Patterns can be misread or influenced over time. But when the same detail begins to repeat across different people in different eras, it becomes harder to ignore. Because this is not just about one story or one claim. It's about a pattern, a detail that keeps returning in the background of accounts that should have nothing to do with one another. So the question is not just whether any one of these stories is true. The question is, why this system? Why does Zeta Reticuli keep appearing again and again across decades of claims, reports, and speculation? To understand that, we need to go back to a moment in 1947, a moment often described as the beginning of something that was never meant to be fully explained. In the summer of 1947, something happened in the desert of New Mexico. At first, it didn't seem unusual. A rancher named William Brazel discovered debris scattered across his land, northwest of a small town called Roswell, New Mexico. Thin, metallic fragments, strange materials, light, but unusually strong. Unsure of what he had found, he reported it. What followed was brief, but significant. On July 8th, 1947, a local military base issued a statement. It claimed that they had recovered a flying disc. The story spread quickly. Newspapers picked it up. The idea of something unidentified falling from the sky captured attention almost instantly. But within hours, the narrative changed. The military retracted the statement. What had been described as a flying disc was now explained as a weather balloon. Nothing unusual. Nothing extraordinary. Just a misunderstanding. And with that, the story should have ended. But it didn't. Because over time, questions began to surface. Why the initial announcement? Why the sudden reversal? Why describe something as a flying disc, only to correct it hours later? For some, the explanation was simple. A mistake. Miscommunication. An overreaction during a time of heightened tension, just 2 years after the end of World War II. But for others, the sequence of events suggested something else. That the original statement had revealed more than it was meant to, and that the correction was not clarification, but control. In the years that followed, additional claims began to emerge. Witnesses, second-hand accounts, stories of materials that did not behave as expected, even suggestions that what was recovered was not just debris, but something more. None of it confirmed, much of it disputed. And yet, the story refused to disappear, because Roswell became something more than an isolated incident. It became a reference point, a moment in time, where something unexplained appeared briefly in the open and was then pulled back. Whether the event itself was extraordinary or entirely ordinary. What followed is harder to dismiss. A shift from openness to silence, from public statements to controlled information, from explanation to ambiguity. If something unusual had been recovered, it would not have remained in the public eye for long. It would have been studied, moved, contained, examined, somewhere out of view. And if that were the case, then Roswell would not be the end of the story. It would be the beginning, a beginning that leads forward into systems designed to manage what could not be explained, places built to operate without visibility, and people who may have worked within them. Because decades later, one of those people would step forward and claim that what began in places like Roswell had not only continued, but had origins far beyond Earth. Zeta Reticuli. If an event like Roswell did occur, if something unusual was recovered, examined, and quietly removed from public view, then the question is not just what happened, it's who took control of it, because something like that would not be handled by a single base or a single officer. It would require coordination, oversight, a structure positioned at the highest levels of government. And it is here that a name begins to appear. Majestic 12. The story of Majestic 12 is tied to a set of documents that surfaced publicly in the 1980s. They described a classified group allegedly formed in the aftermath of Roswell. A group made up of 12 individuals, senior figures, drawn from science, military leadership, and intelligence. The names listed were not obscure. They were individuals who, at the time, held significant authority. Figures such as Vannevar Bush, who had overseen scientific research during World War II. James Forrestal, the first United States Secretary of Defense. Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And Nathan Twining, a senior Air Force general, later chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If the documents were genuine, this was not a fringe group. It was positioned at the center of power. According to the material, their role was direct: to oversee the recovery, analysis, and containment of materials not originating from Earth, to coordinate efforts across military and scientific divisions, to ensure that information remained controlled, and to manage the subject at a level above standard government channels. The structure described was precise. Reports, clearance levels, compartmentalized programs. Nothing about it felt accidental. But the problem has always been the same. The documents cannot be verified. Their origin remains unclear. No official confirmation has ever been given. And over the years, they have been analyzed, challenged, and in many cases, dismissed. Some argue they are elaborate fabrications, created using real names, to give the illusion of authenticity. Others believe they may contain elements of truth, fragments of something real, altered, or incomplete. And this uncertainty is where Majestic 12 remains. Not confirmed, not entirely dismissed, but persistent, because even if the documents themselves are not genuine, the idea behind them raises a question that is harder to ignore. If something had been recovered, something that required long-term study, would it not require a group like this? A structure positioned above normal operations, a system designed to manage information, limit exposure, and coordinate research across multiple agencies. Because something like that would not stay in the open. It would be moved, relocated, studied somewhere, designed specifically for that purpose. A place built for secrecy. And over time, one location would become associated with that idea more than any other. A place that, officially, did not exist for decades. A place where testing occurred, where projects remained hidden, where access was tightly controlled. Area 51. Whether Majestic 12 was real, fabricated, or something in between, the concept it represents never left. That if something extraordinary had been found, it would not remain uncontained. It would be studied, and somewhere, someone would be working on it. If something had been recovered, if it required long-term study, careful analysis, and absolute secrecy, then it would not remain where it was found. It would be moved, relocated, somewhere controlled, somewhere isolated. And in the United States, there are few places more isolated than the Nevada desert. Vast stretches of land, dry lake beds, mountain ranges, little infrastructure, almost no civilian presence, but more importantly, large sections of it have long been under military control. One of those areas is known as the Nevada Test and Training Range, a region used for decades to develop, test, and refine some of the most advanced technology in the world. It was here, in the 1950s, that a remote facility was established. A base built near a dry lake bed known as Groom Lake. Its purpose at the time was clear: to test aircraft that could not be seen. High-altitude reconnaissance planes designed to operate beyond the reach of existing radar systems. The U-2, an aircraft capable of flying higher than anything before it, invisible to most detection methods of its time. Later, the A-12, then early stealth technology. Programs that required not just innovation, but secrecy, because these were not just engineering projects, they were strategic advantages, and testing them in open airspace would have revealed their existence. So they were moved here, hidden within restricted airspace. Aircraft would fly, unseen, observed only by those with clearance. And even then, information was compartmentalized. This was not unusual. It was standard practice. And for decades, the facility itself was not officially acknowledged. No mention, no confirmation, until much later, when its existence was finally recognized, long after many of its projects had already become public knowledge. But by then, Area 51 had already taken on a different identity, because alongside its very real history, another layer had begun to form. Stories, reports, accounts of things that did not fit within known programs. Lights in the sky, moving in ways conventional aircraft could not. Sudden acceleration, unusual flight paths. Most of these accounts could be explained. Experimental aircraft being tested before public disclosure. Technology years ahead of what people expected to exist. But not all of them. And it is here that the narrative begins to shift, because within the broader story of Area 51, another detail began to emerge. Not just a base, but a deeper location. A section described as separate, more restricted, referred to as S4. Unlike Area 51, S4 does not officially exist. No documentation, no acknowledgement, only descriptions from those who claim to have been there. According to those claims, S4 was located further south, near a mountain range, built into the landscape itself. Hangars, concealed within the side of a mountain, designed to remain invisible, even from the air. Access tightly controlled. Movement restricted. Information compartmentalized to the point where individuals only knew what they needed to know. And the purpose of this facility, according to those accounts, was not the development of new aircraft, but the study of something already built. Objects that did not originate from known human technology. Craft that behave differently, not powered in ways that could be easily understood, not constructed with familiar materials. And the work taking place there was not creation, it was analysis. Taking something apart, piece by piece, trying to understand how it functioned, trying to replicate it, quietly, hidden, within a system already designed to remain out of view. If Area 51 represented secrecy, then S4 represented something deeper. Secrecy within secrecy. And it is within this environment that one individual would later claim to have worked, not as a witness from a distance, but as someone brought inside, someone who said he had seen these objects directly, studied them, worked on them, and when he eventually spoke, he did not just describe what he saw, He described where it came from: Zeta Reticuli. In 1989, a man named Bob Lazar stepped forward with a story that would quickly become one of the most debated claims in modern history. At the time, he was not a public figure, but he was not entirely unknown either. Lazar had a background that placed him close to the edges of advanced scientific work. He had worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, a facility deeply connected to nuclear research. His name appeared in internal directories. He was photographed there. And while the exact nature of his role remains debated, he was, at minimum, present within an environment where high-level scientific work was being conducted. Outside of that, he had a reputation for unusual projects. He had modified vehicles, built experimental systems, even attached a jet engine to a car, simply to see if it could be done. He was not operating within traditional academic pathways, but he was clearly drawn to complex systems, according to his account. It was this combination of exposure and interest that led to something unexpected. He claimed he was recruited, not through a public process, not through formal application, but through a connection, a referral, tied to his previous work. He described being brought into a program with little explanation, limited information. The process itself, he said, was fragmented. Clearances were introduced gradually. Access was restricted. Even basic details were withheld. He was not given a complete picture, only what he needed for the task in front of him. And that task, according to Lazar, was to study propulsion systems, not to design them, but to understand something that already existed, something he said had been recovered. He described being transported to a remote location, south of Area 51, a facility referred to as S4, built into the side of a mountain, hidden both physically and administratively. And it was there, he claimed, that he first saw them. Craft, disc-shaped, unfamiliar, not experimental aircraft, not prototypes, but objects that, he believed, were not made on Earth. Inside, he said there were multiple units, each slightly different, not identical copies, but variations, as if they had been produced over time. His role was narrow. He was assigned to examine the propulsion system, to try and understand how these craft were able to move. He described a system that did not rely on thrust, did not rely on lift, but instead manipulated gravity itself, a propulsion method that bent space rather than pushing through it. At the center of this system was a material he referred to as Element 115. At the time, this element had not been created. It did not officially exist, He claimed it was stable, that it could produce energy in a way not publicly understood. Years later, scientists would synthesize element 115, but only briefly, unstable, lasting fractions of a second. Nothing like what he had described. And this is where his story begins to divide opinion, because while some of his claims appear ahead of their time, others raise questions. Details about his education are difficult to confirm. Records incomplete. Institutions he claimed to have attended have no clear documentation. And yet, parts of his background remain verifiable. His connection to Los Alamos, his presence within technical environments, which leaves an uncomfortable middle ground, too detailed to dismiss entirely, too inconsistent to accept without question. But beyond the technical descriptions, beyond the debate over credibility, there is one detail that remains constant. When asked where the craft originated, he did not hesitate. He gave a location. Zeta Reticuli. Not a vague answer. Not an unknown region. A specific star system. The same system that had appeared decades earlier in a completely separate account. And this is where the story shifts, because Lazar was not simply describing what he had seen, he was reinforcing a pattern, a detail that had surfaced before and would continue to surface again, whether his account is true, partially true, or entirely constructed. The question remains, why this system? Why does the same location appear across different stories, separated by time and context? Because if Lazar's claim is dismissed, then it becomes coincidence. But if even a small part of it holds, then the story extends far beyond a single man. It becomes something larger, something that connects events, locations, and accounts back to a single point of origin. Zeta Reticuli. Nearly 3 decades before Bob Lazar, long before Area 51 had entered public conversation, another account began to take shape. Not in a laboratory, not inside a restricted facility, but on a quiet road, late at night. In September of 1961, a couple named Betty Hill and Barney Hill were driving home through rural New Hampshire. They had been visiting family. A normal trip. A long drive. Returning late. They were not public figures. Not connected to science or the military. Betty worked as a social worker. Barney, a postal employee. They lived a quiet life. By all accounts, they were ordinary as they drove along a dark stretch of highway. They noticed something in the sky. At first, distant. A light. unusual, but not immediately alarming. But as they continued driving, the object appeared to move closer. It did not behave like an aircraft. It did not follow a straight path. It changed direction, hovered, at times, seeming to track them. Barney stopped the car, stepped out. He later described seeing a craft above them, silent, watching. What followed was not immediately clear, because when they eventually arrived home, something didn't feel right. There was a gap, a period of time they could not account for. Their watches had stopped. Their clothes showed signs of wear. And both of them experienced a sense that something had happened, but could not fully recall it. In the days that followed, that feeling did not go away. It intensified. Betty began having vivid dreams, scenes that felt more like memories. Barney became increasingly unsettled. Eventually, they sought help. Through hypnosis, fragments began to surface. Description, moments, details that, under normal circumstances, they could not explain. They spoke of being taken, of being examined. But among all of these details, one stood out. Betty described being shown something. A map, a pattern of stars, connected in a way she did not recognize. Lines between points. Certain stars emphasized, others left isolated. She said she was told that it represented where they had come from. At the time, it meant nothing. She was not an astronomer. She had no reason to recognize star systems. So she did what she could. She drew it. From memory. A simple sketch. Dots, connected by lines. For years, the drawing remained just that. A personal record. Something strange, but unverified. Then, years later, the sketch was examined more closely, compared against known star systems. One interpretation in particular stood out, a possible match to a nearby binary system. Zeta Reticuli, 2 stars in close orbit, surrounded by a pattern that resembled what Betty had drawn. Not a perfect match, not universally accepted, but close enough to raise questions. Because this was 1961, long before the internet, long before widespread access to detailed astronomical data. No obvious reason for that specific system to appear in her account. And yet, it did. Over time, The Hill case became one of the most well-known accounts of its kind, studied, debated, analyzed from multiple perspectives. Some viewed it as psychological, a product of stress, suggestion, or memory distortion. Others believed it contained elements that were harder to dismiss. But regardless of interpretation, one detail remained: the map, a specific pattern, a specific location. Zeta Reticuli. And this is where the story begins to tighten, because nearly 3 decades later, a completely different individual, Bob Lazar, with no connection to the Hills, would describe technology that he claimed came from that same system. Not a similar region, not a vague direction, the same name. Zeta Reticuli. Individually, each account can be explained, but together they begin to form a pattern. And once a pattern appears, it becomes harder to ignore. As these accounts began to accumulate across different decades, different locations, different individuals, one detail began to repeat with unusual consistency. Not a place, not a craft, but a description. Witnesses, often with no connection to one another, described similar beings, small in stature, thin bodies, large heads, disproportionate to the rest of the frame, and most notably, large, dark eyes. They would later become known simply as the Greys. The name itself is informal, a label applied after the fact, but the descriptions remained consistent across reported encounters, across hypnotic regressions, across individuals who had no reason to share the same imagery. The details varied slightly, but the core characteristics remained: smooth skin, minimal facial features, no visible hair. A presence that was often described not as aggressive, but as controlled, detached, observing rather than interacting in a human sense. In many accounts, communication was not spoken, but understood, as if thoughts were being transferred directly. Ideas, rather than words. And this is where the descriptions begin to shift from physical appearance into something more difficult to define, because the Greys are not just described as beings, they are described as purposeful, operating with intent, often within structured environments, within craft, within controlled spaces, not random, not chaotic, but organized. And this raises a question. If these descriptions are accurate, then what are they? Are they a species, a form of life, originating somewhere beyond Earth? If so, then the connection to Zeta Reticuli becomes one possible explanation, a nearby system, close enough, in cosmic terms, to be considered reachable. But that is only one interpretation, because another possibility begins to emerge within the same accounts, that the Greys may not be entirely separate from us, that they are not visitors, but something else, a version of ourselves. In some descriptions, their physical form appears altered, reduced musculature, larger cranial structure, as if the body has adapted over time, prioritizing cognition over physical strength, eyes enlarged, perhaps suited to different environments, different light conditions. And this has led to another theory, that the Greys are not an external species, but a future evolution of humanity, a version of us that has changed over time, possibly leaving Earth, possibly adapting to environments beyond it. And if that were the case, then their presence here would not be exploration, but observation, a return, monitoring their own origin. But even that is not the only possibility, because in other interpretations, the relationship is reversed, that humanity is not the origin, but the result, that we are not observing them, but that we were shaped by them, an engineered species, developed over time, guided or influenced by something that came before. And if that were true, then the connection to Zeta Reticuli is no longer incidental. It becomes foundational, an origin point. But these ideas remain exactly that. Ideas, interpretations, built from fragments, because there is no confirmed evidence that defines what the Greys are. No agreement, no clarity, only recurring descriptions, repeated across time. And that is what makes them difficult to dismiss entirely. Because even when the stories differ, even when the circumstances change, the image remains. The same form, the same presence, appearing again and again, within accounts that should have no connection. And in many of those accounts, the same question appears alongside them. Where do they come from? And once again, the same answer begins to surface. If the previous accounts raise questions about who these beings are, then this part of the story raises a different question entirely. What are they doing? Because across a number of reported encounters, there is a pattern that goes beyond observation. It involves people, and it involves biology. One of the earliest individuals to describe this in detail was Betty Hill. During her hypnotic sessions, she did not just describe a craft. She described procedures, examinations, needles, samples being taken. At the time, it was interpreted as medical. Strange, but clinical. But in later decades, other individuals began describing something more specific. Bud Hopkins, an artist turned researcher, was one of the first to document recurring patterns across multiple accounts. People who had never met, describing similar experiences, not just observation, but interaction, particularly involving reproduction. He collected accounts of individuals who believed they had been taken and subjected to procedures involving their reproductive systems, sperm samples, egg extraction, details that, at the time, were difficult to place within any known framework. Later, another researcher, David M. Jacobs, expanded on these claims. Through years of interviews and hypnotic regression, he proposed something more structured, that these encounters were not isolated, but part of an ongoing program, a process focused on creating what he described as hybrids, beings that were not entirely human and not entirely something else. And this is where the connection to the Greys becomes clearer. In many of these accounts, the beings overseeing these procedures match the same description: small, thin, large dark eyes, the same presence described across decades. But in these cases, they are not just observing, they are directing, guiding the process, and some individuals claim they were shown the result. Children, not fully human, not fully alien, something in between. In certain accounts, witnesses describe being asked to interact with them, to hold them, as if there was recognition, as if there was a connection. And this is where the theory begins to shift, because if these accounts are taken seriously, then this is no longer about visitation. It becomes about integration, the possibility that whatever these beings are, they are not just studying humanity, they are attempting to merge with it. But why? One explanation is survival. That these beings, whatever they are, may no longer be able to reproduce naturally, that they require human genetics to continue. Another possibility is adaptation, that combining genetic traits allows for something new, a form better suited to different environments. But there is a third interpretation that is more difficult to ignore, that this process did not begin recently, that it has been occurring over a much longer period of time. Subtle, gradual, unnoticed. And if that were the case, then the line between human and something else becomes less clear. Because the question is no longer just, what are they doing to us? it becomes, how long has this been happening? And whether these accounts are literal, symbolic, or something in between, they continue to appear, repeated, across individuals, across decades, each one adding detail, each one reinforcing a pattern. Not enough to confirm, but enough to make the question difficult to dismiss entirely. By the early 2000s, a new story began to circulate, not through official documents, not through interviews on television, but through anonymous emails sent into the world of UFO researchers and discussion groups. It became known as Project Serpo. According to the most common version of the story, it began with Roswell, not just a crash in the New Mexico desert in 1947, but a crash in which one being allegedly survived, a non-human survivor, an entity that, according to the story, was recovered by the United States military, contained, observed, and eventually communicated with. In later retellings, this being was often referred to as EBE, an extraterrestrial biological entity. The claim was that over time, contact was established between this survivor and its homeworld, that messages were exchanged, that trust, or in some form, was built, and that years later, this led to an agreement, an exchange program. According to the Serpo story, a team of 12 Americans was selected, military personnel, specialists, scientists, people chosen not because they were famous, but because they could function inside a mission that would never officially exist. The destination, according to the claim, was a planet called Serpo, a world said to orbit within the Zeta Reticuli system, a distant home linked, once again, to the same chain of stories we have followed throughout this film. The mission, as told in the public Serpo narrative, was not short. This was not an abduction story, not a single night, not a brief contact event. It was described as a long-term human presence on another world. Years, not hours. And according to the story, the experience was brutal. Serpo was said to have intense radiation, a harsh climate, and living conditions that were physically punishing for humans. The beings encountered there were described in familiar terms: small, thin, large eyes, the same general form that appears again and again across encounter literature. The same image many people would associate with the Greys. According to the claims, the American team observed their society, learned how they lived, saw a civilization that was structured, controlled, and highly organized. Communication was described not as ordinary speech, but as something more direct, more compressed, as if ideas were passed rather than spoken. And then comes the part that matters most: the return, because according to Serpo law, not everyone came home. This is where the story begins to split. In one version, All 12 eventually died from the effects of the mission and the world they had entered. In another, one died on the outbound journey. One died on Serpo. 2 chose to remain there. And 8 returned to Earth. That version is the one that captured people's attention. Because if 8 came back, then the obvious question is this: what did they bring with them? What did they learn? And what changed because of it? But here, the story becomes frustratingly thin. The public Serpo material does not offer a clean, concrete answer. There is no verified list of technologies, no documented invention, no confirmed government shift that can be tied to the mission. No provable trail showing that the returnees reshaped the modern world. Instead, what the story leaves behind is something more ambiguous. That knowledge was gained, but remained classified. That lessons were brought back, but never released. That whatever was learned was absorbed into systems already built to contain extraordinary information. And maybe that is why Serpo has endured. Not because it proves anything, but because it extends the question. Roswell suggests recovery. Majestic suggests control. Area 51 suggests concealment. Lazar suggests study. And Serpo suggests something further still. Exchange. Contact sustained long enough to change the people who experienced it. Whether that happened in reality or only in story is still the unresolved part. But the shape of the claim is clear. A survivor from Roswell. Communication. A mission. A return. And a silence that was never fully broken. That's the version of Serpo that stayed with people. Not because it was proven, but because it pushed the mystery further than almost any story before it. Across decades, the story never stays in one place. It shifts from a desert crash to classified documents from hidden facilities, to individuals who claim to have seen inside them, from a couple driving home at night, to patterns drawn from memory, from descriptions of beings, to questions about intention, and eventually to the idea that contact may not be brief, but sustained. Individually, each part can be dismissed, misidentified, misremembered, misunderstood, but taken together, they begin to form something else. Not a clear answer, but a shape, a pattern that repeats across time, across people, across entirely different types of accounts. And that may be the most important part of all, because stories that are purely invented tend to fade. They lose structure. They disappear. But some stories don't. They return in different forms, through different voices, carrying the same fragments, again and again So the question is not just what happened, it's why the same details keep appearing, and whether that repetition is coincidence or something else entirely.